She was meant to be sold by her brother, but a lonely lumberman stopped it. The wind howled like a starving wolf through the dead firs of Timberwolf Ridge. Winter had frozen the land in silence. No birds, no breath, just the groan of an old wooden wagon buried in snow. Chained to its back wheel stood a girl, Evelyn Ray, 21. Her coat was thin, her hands swollen from cold. Beneath a patchwork shawl, the curve of a belly ready to give life. Her wrists bled where iron cuffs bit into them, but her eyes didn't beg. They burned. Beside her, like a shadow made flesh, her brother, Wade McCallan, smelling of whiskey with the cold eyes of a man who never looked back. Across from them stood a fur-wrapped traitor, eyes greedy, mouth wet with tobacco spit. "She's strong," Wade said flatly. "Due soon, she'll work." The traitor chuckled. "And if she don't?" Wade didn't blink. "Then she dies. Ain't my problem." And then, hoofbeats. One rider, one horse, one man, wrapped in wolfskin, silent, watching. His name, Calder Shaw, a lonely lumberman with no town, no kin, but fire in his chest. He didn't speak at first, just stared at Evelyn. And then, quietly, "She's not for sale." But before anyone could reach her, she ran. The cuff had loosened. Her wrist tore free in blood and rust. She bolted into the trees, boots slipping through the snow, heart crashing louder than the hooves that chased her. Wade screamed her name, but she didn't stop, didn't turn. The trees swallowed her whole. She vanished into the forest, into the cold, into the dark, somewhere between death and hope. The ride through the timber was long and silent. Snowflakes clung to Evelyn's lashes as she leaned forward in the saddle, her breath catching in her chest, not from the cold, but from the weight of disbelief. She had no idea where he was taking her, no idea why he had stopped that exchange, or why he had thrown away what little he had for a girl he didn't even know. But something in the way he rode, steady, silent, watchful, made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. The trees grew thicker as the light dimmed, the pines leaning in like old giants guarding a secret. They crested a hill, and there it was, tucked deep between the folds of the forest, half swallowed by mist and shadow. A small, wooden cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. A wooden fence wound lazily around the front yard, broken in places by snowdrifts. It wasn't much, but it wasn't chains, and that made it everything. Calder dismounted first and offered her a hand. She hesitated, but then her legs, numb from fear and riding, gave out, and she collapsed into him. He didn't flinch. He caught her, lifted her gently, and carried her inside without a word. The warmth hit her like a wave. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Rough-hewn furniture sat scattered, a table, 2 chairs, a bed low to the ground covered in thick furs and hand-stitched quilts. He set her down on the edge of the bed and fetched a tin cup, filling it from a kettle hanging near the fire. "Drink," he said quietly. She took it, her hands shaking. The warmth slid down her throat and loosened something in her chest. She coughed, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away, just sat across from her, one arm resting on his knee, his eyes steady. "You look like you wanted out," he said finally. She laughed, a broken sound, sharp and bitter. "Wanted out," she echoed. "Wanted to breathe, to eat, to live." "You still can," he said. The silence between them settled again, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of 2 people figuring out if the other could be trusted. Evelyn's fingers played absently with the edge of the shawl wrapped around her belly. She felt the baby shift inside her. Just a flutter, and her eyes welled up. "Do you have a name?" she asked. "Calder Shaw," she nodded. "Evelyn," another pause. "I don't know if I'm going to make it," she said, "not just because of the baby, because I don't remember how to be anything but afraid." Calder leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. "Fear don't make you weak, it means you're still alive." She watched him for a long moment. "You live here alone?" "I've lived here long enough." "No wife? No children?" "No." "Why not?" He shrugged. "I was born with more silence than words, I guess." Evelyn smiled faintly, then winced. The baby kicked harder this time. She shifted, breathing through it. Calder stood immediately, kneeling beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. He kicks like he means it. He's strong. Calder's eyes softened just slightly. That's good, he said. He'll need to be. That night, she slept under more blankets than she'd ever known. Calder kept the fire going through the dark, and though he stayed in the loft above, she heard him walking quietly through the night, checking windows, stoking the flames, standing guard. In the morning, she awoke to the smell of stew and bread. Her belly growled. Calder handed her a bowl and said nothing as she ate like someone who hadn't been fed in weeks. The days that followed were slow and cautious. She learned where the water came from, how to split kindling without straining her belly, and how Calder liked his coffee. Strong, black, silent. They didn't speak much, but when they did, the words were real. One morning while she sat near the fire, sewing a torn edge of her shawl, she asked, "Why didn't you just keep riding?" "I did once," he said. "What happened?" "Someone paid the price for my silence." She didn't press. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "Thank you." He didn't say anything in return, but the way he stood beside her when the wind howled louder than usual said everything. The quiet in the cabin began to feel less like absence and more like peace. Evelyn began to hum again, soft little melodies she didn't realize she still remembered. Sometimes Calder would pause when he heard them, just for a second, before returning to whatever task he was doing. But peace, like all good things in the wild, never stays long. By morning, the storm had softened, but the silence lingered. The wind no longer howled, it listened. Evelyn stirred beneath the fur-lined cloak Calder had placed over her in the night, blinking slowly as the light of dawn filtered through the pines. Her hands trembled as she sat up, still wrapped in layers that were not hers, still wondering if she'd woken into another nightmare. Calder stood nearby, not watching her, but tending to the fire. He poured water into a tin pot, his movements slow, deliberate. No words passed between them for several minutes, only the crackle of flame and the occasional whistle of pine boughs outside. "You didn't have to stay," Evelyn said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," Calder replied. He didn't turn to face her, just stirred the water. "Why did you?" "I told you," he said. "I don't leave people in chains." She swallowed hard. "That's not the same as dragging them through frozen woods." At that, Calder finally turned. His face was unreadable, not cold, not kind, just still. "Would you rather be back with him?" Evelyn looked away, eyes stinging. "No, just not used to men doing anything without expecting something." He didn't respond to that, just handed her a cup, steam curling from its rim. She took it with shaking hands and sipped, the warmth biting at her throat. Later they rode. Quiet, slow. Calder's horse moved like it knew not to startle the woman on its back. Evelyn didn't ask where they were going, and Calder didn't offer. But when the trees finally opened to reveal a narrow valley blanketed in mist, and at its heart, a small wooden cabin, she let out the first breath she'd held since childhood. The place wasn't grand, a lean-to of logs and stone, its roof bowed slightly from snow. But it stood, and from its chimney curled smoke. Calder helped her down. She winced as her boots met the earth, but didn't complain. "This yours?" she asked. He nodded once. "It's enough." She followed him inside. The warmth wrapped around her like something she'd forgotten existed. Pine-scented air, a low-burning fire, simple shelves lined with dried herbs and bundles of wool. A table, a bed, a life. He pointed to the bed. "You can sleep there. I'll take the loft." She stared at him. "I haven't earned this." "You survived," Calder said. "That's enough for now." And for the first time in what felt like 100 years, Evelyn slept without chains or fear. When she woke, there was stew on the fire and bread beside the hearth. Calder was outside chopping wood, his axe slicing rhythm into the silence. They didn't speak much that first day, but on the second, Evelyn found her voice again. "I used to sing," she said, fingers tracing the rim of a wooden bowl. Calder glanced over. "Then why'd you stop?" She shrugged. "Hard to sing when you're running out of air." He didn't smile, but he nodded. Another evening, while peeling potatoes, she asked, "You ever lost someone?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Who?" "Myself," he answered, and the silence between them deepened, not with pain, but understanding. They became something fragile and strange. Not friends, not yet, But something like warmth in the dead of winter. She began humming again, softly. At first he said nothing. But one night, as she sang a lullaby under her breath, Calder said without looking up, "You'll be a good mother." She blinked at him. "You don't know that. I know you stayed alive. I know you kept the baby alive. That counts." Evelyn's throat tightened. She turned away, pretending to busy herself with the stew. But her eyes burned. Still, peace is a delicate thing. The air inside the cabin was heavy with firelight and fear. Evelyn's fingers gripped Calder's forearm like a lifeline as another wave of pain surged through her. He knelt beside her, his hand trembling near hers, unsure if he was helping, unsure if she even knew he was there, but never once pulling away. The blanket soaked with sweat, her jaw clenched so hard she bled where her teeth met her tongue. And then, as if the storm inside her had torn itself open, a gasp, a cry, a silence, and then the softest sound in the world. Not louder than the crackle of the fire, barely louder than her breathing, but it was there. A whimper, wet and fragile, rising from the small bundle Calder gently wrapped in a dry, warm cloth and placed into Evelyn's arms. Her eyes, wild and exhausted, softened instantly. She stared down at the child, her child, as if nothing else in the world could move. Calder said nothing. He only sat beside her, watching. The same way you'd watch a fire take its first breath in deep winter. Careful not to scare it, careful not to hope too much. "I never thought," Evelyn whispered, but the words never finished. A moment passed, then another, and then a sound. Not from within, from outside. A knock. No, not a knock, a pounding. Calder's back straightened. Evelyn clutched the baby tighter to her chest, instinct overwhelming exhaustion. The front door rattled as another blow landed. A boot or a fist, they couldn't tell, but it was urgent, angry, and heavy. "Calder," came a voice. Low, rough. "Wade." Calder rose to his feet, slow as dusk, and took the axe handle from beside the hearth. He didn't grip it like a weapon. Not yet, but it was clear he remembered its weight. "Stay there," he said without turning. "Don't move. Don't speak. Keep the baby warm." Evelyn's mouth opened to protest, but her body refused. She could only nod. The third pound came, louder now, and then silence. Through the frostbitten window, Calder could see silhouettes. 4 figures in total, 3 behind Wade. One held a lantern. Another leaned on something long. A rifle? The others were harder to read, just dark shapes in the snow. Calder opened the door slowly, not all the way, just enough for firelight to spill out onto Wade's face. He looked worse than before, like rage had lived in him for weeks without food. "You took what's mine," Wade growled. "Now I'm here to take it back." "She was never yours," Calder said. Wade spat into the snow. "She's blood. You sold her like a sack of oats." Wade's eyes flickered past Calder to something deeper in the cabin. "And I see you've taken the rest. Didn't waste no time, did you?" Calder didn't move. "Turn around. You don't belong here." "Either does she," Wade said. "You think hiding in these woods makes you something? You think dragging her into your little cabin makes her yours?" "She's not mine," Calder said simply. "She's free." Wade let out a laugh, a bitter bark. "Free? From what? She's got nothing, not even a name left." Calder stepped forward. "She has a child, she has peace, and she has me standing between you and whatever filthy idea you brought with you." Wade's hand twitched toward his belt. A hush fell over the clearing. One of the shadows behind him shifted uneasily, another lowered his lantern. "You sure about this?" one of them muttered. "She's my sister," Wade snapped without turning. "You want to get paid or not?" Calder didn't wait for the next word. He swung the door wide and stood tall on the threshold, the axe handle now resting firm in his hands. "She's a mother now," Calder said, "and if you walk through that door, you'll never walk out again." Wade stepped forward. Evelyn, from behind the bed frame, pulled the blanket tighter over the baby's head and shut her eyes. A single snowflake floated in through the open doorway, melting on the warm wood floor like a drop of warning. Wade's foot pressed against the threshold, his shoulders rising like a storm cloud ready to break. Calder didn't flinch. His grip around the axe tightened, but his face remained carved from stone. Not anger, not fear, just readiness. Behind him, the fire cracked, and Evelyn's shallow breaths whispered through the cabin as she crouched beside the newborn, shielding it with her entire body. Wade's second step was slower, deliberate. The men behind him didn't follow. Not yet. But their eyes flicked toward each other, unsure whether to intervene or watch. "You think I won't?" Wade hissed. "You think I won't drag her out of here by the hair?" "I think," Calder said, his voice low and slow as a rising flood, "you've been hurting people too long and calling it your right." Wade's hand moved fast, not to draw a gun but to swing a fist, but Calder had waited for that. The axe didn't fall like a weapon. It came sideways, handle first, slamming into Wade's ribs hard enough to send him staggering back into the snow. He gasped, doubled over, cursing through clenched teeth, but he didn't fall. The men behind him hesitated, then one stepped forward. "Enough," Calder barked. "You don't want this fight." "Then give us what we came for," the tallest one said. "You came for silver," Calder answered. "You'll leave with shame." But Wade was already back on his feet, blood at the corner of his mouth, hate in his eyes. He lunged again, and this time Calder met him chest to chest. The axe dropped. Fists crashed. Wood cracked under boots as they slammed into the side of the doorframe, grappling like wolves in the deep of winter. Calder was stronger, but Wade fought like someone who'd never cared what broke. Inside, Evelyn cried out. Not loud, not for help, just a sound of helplessness, of watching something you'd run from for years rise again. She wrapped both arms around the baby and crawled behind the stacked wood near the hearth, every instinct screaming to stay hidden. Wade slammed Calder against the post and reached for the knife at his boot, but Calder twisted and drove his elbow into Wade's shoulder, sending the blade spinning across the floor. "You can't win this," Calder growled. Wade laughed through blood. "I don't need to win. I just need to ruin it." They crashed into the cabin, now inside, snow blowing in behind them. Calder shoved Wade backward, but Wade grabbed the lantern from the shelf and hurled it toward the fire. It smashed against the stone hearth, spilling oil. Flames flared up the wall like wild breath. "No!" Evelyn screamed, covering the child as heat licked the edges of the cabin. Calder moved fast, not toward Wade, toward the flame. He grabbed the thick wool blanket off the bed and smothered the blaze just as it began to climb, coughing from the smoke. Wade used the moment to reach the baby, but Evelyn was faster. She turned her back to him, shielding the bundle, and screamed. Not in fear, in fury, in defiance. Her voice cracked the air like a whip. "Touch him, and I swear to God." Calder was already there. He tackled Wade into the doorframe so hard the wood cracked. This time, Wade dropped, breathing, bleeding, beaten. Calder didn't move, just stood over him, chest rising, firelight flickering across his soaked coat. Outside, the three men looked at one another again, but none moved forward. Not now, not against this man, not for this price. Wade spat in the snow again. This time it was pink. "You think this ends it?" He coughed. "You think you saved her? You think that baby erases what we are?" Calder didn't answer. He just knelt and picked up the axe, not to swing, not to threaten, just to remind them both of the weight of the choices made. "Go," he said quietly, and Wade did, limping, alone. The others followed behind him in silence, their boots crunching through fresh snow, the sky above now deep with night, not a word between them. No one looked back. Calder stood in the open doorway, watching them vanish into the trees. Then, slowly, he closed the door, and for the first time in hours, there was silence. Not fear, not heat, just silence. Behind him, Evelyn sat against the wall, her arms around the child, tears streaking her face but her breathing steady. Calder knelt beside her, didn't speak, didn't reach, just sat. With her, beside the fire, as the baby slept between them. And somewhere beyond the trees, Timberwolf Ridge breathed again. The cabin had gone quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, more like the echo of something shattered. The fire still burned in the hearth, crackling softly, but the room around it looked like a storm had torn through. Chairs broken, a table knocked sideways. Blood smeared in streaks along the wooden floor, trailing from where Wade had fallen. Evelyn stood in the corner, still clutching the baby wrapped in a wool blanket, her arms trembling, though her grip never loosened. Her breath came in shallow waves, but she wasn't crying. She just stared, as if afraid that blinking would bring it all crashing down again. Calder stood over Wade's unconscious body, his chest heaving from the fight, a bruise already blooming under one eye. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. One hand still held the bloodied axe handle. The other reached up slowly to wipe the sweat from his brow. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He looked at Evelyn, not with pity or fear, but something steady, assuring, like the worst had passed. Maybe it had. But outside, in the dark beyond the cabin, the men Wade had brought lingered. Two had fled during the chaos, but one remained, his silhouette barely visible through the frost-covered window. Calder didn't move to chase him. He knew better than to turn his back on quiet shadows. He stepped to the door and closed it slowly, bolting it shut. Then he dragged a chair in front of it, not because it would stop someone from entering, but because it gave them all a moment to breathe. "I'll tie him," Calder said simply, nodding to Wade. "He's not leaving here like this." Evelyn only nodded once, clutching the bundle in her arms closer to her chest. She finally sank into the rocking chair by the fire, her knees folding beneath her, her whole body slowly surrendering to exhaustion. The baby let out a soft sound, a tiny whimper more felt than heard, and Evelyn hushed it instinctively, pressing a kiss to the top of its head. Calder tore a strip of cloth from one of the coats hung by the door and bound Wade's hands tightly behind his back. Then he rolled the man onto his side and checked for breath. Alive but barely conscious. He wouldn't be rising anytime soon. "You're safe now," Calder finally said, lowering himself onto the floor opposite Evelyn. His voice was softer than before, not weak, but gentler, like worn leather or the lull in a storm. "You and the child." Evelyn nodded again, but this time her eyes closed and a single tear slid down her cheek. I thought he'd take her from me." Calder didn't reply right away. He stared into the fire. Then, he tried, but he didn't. The warmth of the flames painted their faces in gold. Evelyn's breathing slowed, though her eyes remained heavy with what had been seen, what had been survived. Calder leaned back against the stone wall, finally letting the weight of the day settle into his bones. "I should have come sooner," he said. "You came," she whispered, and for a while neither spoke. Only the wind moaned outside and the baby's breathing filled the spaces between heartbeats. Calder closed his eyes. Evelyn leaned back in the chair. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she let herself drift into a kind of sleep not haunted by footsteps or chains. Morning came quietly, slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls like forgiveness. The snow outside had stopped sometime in the night, and the sky wore a shade of pale silver, soft and still. Inside, the hearth had burned low, but the warmth hadn't left. Calder stirred first, rising from his place near the door, his limbs stiff from sleeping on wood, but his mind steady. He checked on Wade, still bound, still unconscious. Then he turned to Evelyn. She hadn't moved far. She was curled on the cot with the baby pressed to her chest, both wrapped in a thick blanket. Her lips barely moved as she breathed, and her face, for the first time since he'd met her, looked free of fear. Calder made tea from dried herbs, poured it into a tin cup and set it beside her. Then he sat at the table, sharpening the edge of his axe, slow and quiet, like a man shaping the future instead of just steel. When Evelyn woke, it was not with a start, but with a long, calm exhale. The baby stirred in her arms. She sat up slowly, took the tea, and sipped it in silence. "I thought I'd never see a morning like this," she said. Calder nodded. "You will. Many more." There was no more talk of Wade, no judgment, no vengeance, just a quiet understanding that the past had reached its end. By noon, Calder had built a sled from scrap wood and lashed Wade's unconscious body to it. He would bring him down to the marshal in the next town, not for revenge, but for justice. Evelyn didn't ask what would happen. She only watched as Calder disappeared into the white woods with his burden and returned alone an hour later, his eyes clear. For the first time in a long while, they both ate together, not in silence, but in peace. She told him about the songs her mother used to sing. He told her about the trees that grew deeper in the valley. They spoke like people who had survived something together. Not lovers, not strangers, but two souls who'd earned the right to speak freely. That night, as the baby slept, Evelyn stepped outside and looked at the stars, her arms crossed against the chill. Calder joined her. He didn't say anything at first, but stood beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. I don't know where this road leads, Evelyn whispered. Neither do I, Calder said, but I'll walk it with you. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, her eyes held something new. Not fear, not pain, but hope. And beneath the endless sky of the frontier they stood, not broken, not lost, but found. Sometimes love doesn't begin with a kiss or a promise. Sometimes it begins with survival, with choosing to stand between the past and the fire. Evelyn was meant to be sold and forgotten, but Calder saw her, not as a burden, not as a broken thing, but as someone worth rescuing. And in the quiet that followed the storm, they chose each other. If stories like this one stir something deep in you, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another tale from the heart of the Wild West.